Hello, friends. Do not adjust your earbuds. Guess what? It is episode 200 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast.
And there was much rejoicing.
We somehow made it, folks. Yes, we made it to the big 200. And if you're new to the show, tuning in for the first time, this is the weekly podcast, well, mostly weekly anyway, that we talk about the latest happenings and resources that are shared on this week's Our Weekly issue. My name is Eric Nance, and I still cannot believe we made it this far. So maybe before I go too much further, let's put a little PSA out there. Yeah, this 200 thing, after this, you know what? I've had a change of heart. I think for episode 201 and more, we're going to call this a SAS Weekly podcast because they don't get enough love. April Fools. If you didn't catch it, you should have. But as we're recording this, it is April Fool's Day, which may be a bad omen for things going forward, but we're going to make it work. But as always, I'm joined by my awesome co-host on this show, who's been with me definitely more than half of those 200 episodes, Mike Thomas. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Eric. What a milestone. Very excited. You scared me there for a second, but it is in the U.S. here, at least. I don't know how international the holiday that is, but it is April Fool's Day, so watch out, beware, especially, I'm sure, for those like you who have young children who love to take advantage of that type of thing.
He already did yesterday as a preview for it. I discovered these tablets we use for his online art class were suddenly taped to my desk, taped to it for some reason. And I'm asking, why do you do that? He's like, April Fool's, Daddy. Well, okay. Well, I'd imagine I'm going to be in much worse shape after he gets home from school today. But nonetheless, we're not going to try to be fools here. We're going to keep it real as usual with the awesome highlights that we have up for tap today. And this week's issue is curated by John Calder, another one of our awesome contributors and curators here on Our Weekly. And as always, he had tremendous help from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your pull requests and other terrific suggestions along the way. Just to put a little PSA out there, poor Mike here's actual mic wasn't quite working as expected, so we had a little bit different audio quality. We'll make it work, though, so again, we're not immune of the shenanigans on this day for sure. Well, I guess it's a time capsule, right? It is episode 200, and typically every week now we got something to talk about in the world of large language models, and we are leading off episode 200 with another great showcase on some of the tooling that's out there for an aspect of the usage of large language models that I personally haven't done as much, but I can see in future projects this will be extremely helpful if you're dealing with a lot of textual-based resources. And this guest post on the Posit blog was authored by Camilla Livio. She is a research professional at the Center for International Trade and Security at the University of Georgia. And this very practical post leads off with, I think, a use case that many of us will be very much in relation to when we deal with our documents in the enterprise or maybe from clients or other projects, where the motivation for her recent effort was being able to compile a list of final reports. These are in PDF format, from an annual conference called the Conference of the Parties. This is spanning from 1995 to 2023. And this is, I haven't heard about this until this post here, this is a yearly conference for global leaders to talk about climate change, some strategies involved, and some new avenues to address those issues. So these conferences do release the summaries of these. And what looks to be a pretty dense, pretty comprehensive PDF file for each year. And so the question is, how can her team be able to generate these summaries and insights that are part of the contents of these reports? Certainly before the advent of large language models, you might tap into the world of text mining, textual analysis, sentiment analysis, where you're going to be setting up, those keywords, maybe those patterns of searching. There are lots of avenues to do that. I know Julia Silge's been a huge part of the efforts in the R community to bring text mining packages to the R ecosystem. So we've actually covered I believe, a fair share of those on some of the previous 200 episodes of this program here. But with the advent of large language models, you got a new take on making life a little bit easier in these regards. And in particular, this post is highlighting the use of the MAL package, which is authored by Edgar Ruiz, one of the software engineers at Posit. And this is a LLM framework in both R and Python. There are separate packages for each to let you run multiple large language model predictions against a data frame, and in particular, looking at methods of textual prediction, textual extraction, and textual summarization. So there are two steps that are outlined in this post about the use of the MAL package. The first step, I guess the precursor of this, is that we have a cleaned version of the report data that Camilla has assembled here in a CSV file. But of course, you might have to leverage other means and perhaps even an LLM itself to just get these from the PDF, which you could do with, say, the Elmer package and the like. But the data set in the example here has 3 columns here, one of which is the name of the file. Second is the raw text that's been scraped from this file. And then another column, which is slightly cleaner version of this text, but it's still, again, the raw text from this PDF, just maybe without a lot of the formatting junk inside. So step 1 of the MAL package, she wanted to generate a new column in this data set that gives a summary of each of these PDF reports. And that's where you can leverage, after you plug in your model of choice, which in this case is the Ollama 3.2 model here. You can run a function called LLM_summarize, where you give it, the clean textual column that you want to extract here, and then give it a name of the new column, and then more importantly, an additional language for the prompt itself that's going to feed into the model, where it was a very basic prompt here, just saying to summarize the key points in the report from this proceedings. And then she gives a little more extra help on the different categories that she likes summarization on. Again, one thing I'm learning is that the more verbose you can be of your prompt, the better, within reason, to give a little better context. And then when that function is completed, she gives a little preview of those extracted columns here, and you can see, looks like pretty straightforward. The 3 key areas that she asked for highlighting, such as the decision-making process, mitigation and adaptation, emission reduction, and other key points were covered in these clean summaries. So again, Ollama model does a pretty nice job there, it looks like. Again, this is only 3 or maybe 5 or so reports here, so we're not getting a huge set here, but this does look promising. That's step 1. Step 2 is now, with this clean summary that, again, is much easier to digest, to read, verbatim, what about extracting some key parts of this summary, perhaps some key words, if you will. Maybe they're related to certain topics. And she has those here using the LLM extract function from MAL, where you can give it these different labels that you want to basically be extracted from here. And in this case, she's looking for energy transition. This is where things get a little more flexible than in the typical large text mining area, where you might have to look at all these different synonyms or other adjectives that would say this phrase and try to grab all that at once. But in this case, with LLM extract, she's able to leverage just this labels column with a very fit for purpose, description here. Like I said, energy transition. And the model is going to be smart enough, hopefully, to extract this phrase, but also ones that are, adjacent to this as well. So after running this function with, again, an additional prompt that was supplied here, you now get a new column here that shows that phrase or an adjacent or, like phrase of that in this extract energy trans column. And you see renewable energy is put in here, energy transition, solar energy. Again, that's one nice benefit here. She didn't have to prospectively think of all those that could be possible. It was just one phrase, one label, and then the model took care of the other patterns that this could be closely adjacent to. So she then did a little visualization on these different keywords that are identified, and you can see that renewable energy was the top of the list, with the other ones of about one occurrence each. And again, you can, build more custom prompts if you wish, such as maybe telling the LLM prompt to answer yes or no, whether this text would mention any challenges in the transition to other forms of energy. And again, you can feed this in with an LLM custom function, which gives you that more customized prompt to grab this information. And sure enough, you get this quote unquote prediction column afterwards with a no or yes that addresses that particular question. So what am I seeing here as someone who doesn't do a lot of day-to-day of textual mining or textual analysis? There have definitely been projects at the day job where we have these, say, study reports or study protocols, and there's a lot of information there. Some of it's quote-unquote structured in tables, and some of it is not. Some of it's more free form. This would be a great utility, I think, to extract those different pieces of a study design, maybe those different variables of interest that maybe have a little difference in their characteristics from one study to another. This seems really promising here, and to be able to leverage MAL combined with large language models with LLMs seems like a pretty nice example here to supercharge your textual mining efforts. So really great blog post here by Camilla, and makes me want to go shopping virtually at this mall, so to speak. What about you, Mike?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're getting so many different LLM-related R packages that sometimes it's hard to keep track of them all. And I really appreciate the blog post here around the MAL package that certainly seems to be tailored specifically towards the open weights models, right? For use cases, perhaps when you don't want to hit a third-party API or you want to use a local model with the Ollama package. I was taking a look at the beautiful package down site that we have here, and I think this references a blog post from our prior week's highlights, in that we have these tab sets under the Getting Started section of the sort of homepage for the package down site, where we have code in both R and Python for leveraging MAL. And as soon as you switch from one to the other, all of the tab sets switch from R to Python, so they're grouped together, which is pretty cool. It's incredible that we have these tools or common sort of interfaces to maybe more back-end APIs across whatever language we care about, and not to get a little too meta, but I recently was selected for PositConf 2025 for anybody that's going to be there. It's sort of my self-pat on the back to talk about this exact thing, how we have a really great data science ecosystem now that's evolving where the language doesn't necessarily matter, because the syntax looks pretty similar in both cases, and we're just able to interface to these common underlying APIs. So I think that's one of the cases that we have here in the MAL package. And if you take a look at the differences between the R syntax and the Python syntax, it's really, really minimal. So it's pretty cool that you can sort of bring your own tool and get the same results at the end of the day. From another higher level perspective, one thing I wonder about in a lot of these use cases is accuracy, right? Versus what you spoke about, Eric, traditional sort of text mining. And I think that's always probably going to depend on how simple or complex the use case is. For simpler cases where you have specific keywords and patterns that you really know are going to be the case 99% of the time or more, you're probably going to benefit from like a more traditional text mining approach that's a white box solution. You know exactly what's going on, and when it does miss, you know why it missed. But obviously when the problem becomes too big for traditional text mining, that's when we can bring in, I think, these LLM-based approaches that are probably really the only tool that we have to be able to accurately do this, but with the trade-off that we don't have as much of a white box to understand when it missed. So we have to do sort of manual evals a lot of the times, if you will. But the fact that we have these tools at all is fantastic, in that folks are bringing, not only developing tools like Mall to allow us to leverage them as comfortably as possible from our own R environment, but we also have folks like Camilla who are drafting up fantastic blog posts that walk us through exactly how to do this stuff. So hats off to everybody involved, the Malt team and Camilla, for developing this fantastic deep dive walkthrough. A great start to the highlights this week.
You bet. And I can see, from my case, you may have this, large set of documents, and it's not like we're eliminating a human in the loop here of like reviewing these results. This is a way to get that intermediate step to make life easier, to look for maybe more targeted summaries and maybe whittling down a list of, say, 150 or 200 some reports down to maybe a list of 5 or 10 that then become a lot more interesting, a lot more easily digestible to review those results. So again, my gears are turning in my head here, because there are projects on top of these study documents that we have, but also just research manuscripts out there of given, therapeutic areas like, say, Alzheimer's or other disease states. And we pay a vendor a lot of money to curate this stuff manually. And it sure would be nice, instead of paying all that money to just get, quote unquote, that study table out or that, high level summary out, that we grab that with the LLM and then, of course, vet it through a human kind of in the loop for review. But my goodness, this could save a lot of money. So I got some people to talk to at the higher ups about this, because we have the models now. This is clearly demonstrating this could be a plug and play for the model of interest, whether it's Llama, or if you're in the enterprise, maybe you could use like Claude or other models on top of this. Seems like it's a ripe time to start exploring this further.
Should we pivot to an hour's worth of hot takes on whether LLMs are going to do peer review for science?
I'm here for it.
All right, let's go to highlight number 2.
And rounding out our highlights today, we're going to take a visit to the good old visualization corner, which has always been a staple on these previous episodes of our weekly highlights. Because as we've seen throughout the life cycle of this very show, my goodness, the things you can accomplish with packages like ggplot2 is absolutely amazing to create publication quality, and to be honest, more than just publication quality, but really eye-catching visualizations that would not look like they came from R. So in this highlight here, we're going to talk about a newer feature that landed into R recently that I think can give your plots a little extra pizzazz, especially with the use of colors. And this post comes to us from James Goldie, whose name may sound familiar. He is a data journalist, but he was also one of the co-leads of that recent Quarto Close Read contest that we talked about a few weeks ago. And he's been a very active member in the visualization kind of data storytelling, piece of the landscape here. And so from his blog, we're going to talk about how you can make novel uses of gradients within R, and in particular, the ggplot2 package. So he leads off with the fact that in today's world of ggplot2, we can do a lot of awesome features, or a lot of awesome visualization techniques with use of fonts, size of labels, and of course colors. But sometimes he would find himself before some of these recent advancements getting like 90% of the way there, but then maybe just give that extra little polish. He had to port it over to Adobe Illustrator or some other software to just give it that last extra bit of polish, especially in the world of colors. Well, it sounds like that might be a thing of the past, because now with ggplot2 and some recent advancements in the grids package, you have a lot more flexibility to make control or use of gradient color scales into your visualizations. And as I mentioned just now, this is building upon the shoulders of the grid package, which actually comes with R itself, but you have to explicitly load it into your session to start taking advantage of the lower level functionalities. But Grid has seen some really awesome advancements that we've covered from Paul Merle and others contributors in this visualization space. And with the grid package that ggplot2 is standing on the shoulders of, you can leverage two great functions. I'll talk about the first one. I'll turn over the mic for the second one. But in the case of, say, a bar chart or other types of visualizations, you might want to consider a linear type of gradient. And that is literally using the linear gradient function under the hood to do all of this. So in this first example with a bar plot of the empty car set, it's actually a histogram. But for the fill of the bars, it's not just a single color. He leverages the linear gradient function going from red to orange. Now, again, this plot itself doesn't look that great, but you're already going to start to see the potential here. Within these linear gradient calls, you've got a lot of flexibility for how many colors you feed into this and how you distribute it. So you can feed in any number of colors, and in this other rainbow-like example, he's got about, looks like 7 colors here. And then the accompanying, data part of this call here is a vector of what you call like stops between 0 and 1, kind of like giving a threshold from going from one color to another and another. So that's all well and good, but you can also change the actual size and position of these gradients using coordinate type arguments of like x1, y1, x2, y2 to give it a little kind of a bounding box, if you will, of where this is going to be fit in. So you could do this horizontally by default, or you could do it vertically. And on top of that, you also get flexibility of the type of units that's going to be using in this kind of gradient transition within the bar itself. And that is using a different unit. In this case, the SNPC or square NPC units that will give you kind of customization on the angle of how this gradient is going to transition. As usual, audio podcast, we're trying our best to narrate here, but you can clearly see a difference between when he used this default unit being specified of this SNPC, where the transition from red to orange is a lot more pronounced, especially earlier on at the bottom of this chart. So you can see you got a lot more flexibility here, and all of this can be plugged in to many different aspects of your plot, such as with groups or within the scales themselves, so that if you have a bar chart of, say, positive and negative values, you can easily feed in these different positional arguments. So it may be at the above the y equals 0 of the axis, you've got a more orangish red color, versus below you might got a bluish color to really distinguish that threshold going from positive to negative. Lots of great ideas here on the linear side of it, but as I've seen, visuals don't always just have those nice little rectangular boundaries. We got to get some circle action here, Mike, and that comes to us with the radial gradients.
Yes, and radial gradients work pretty similarly. You're going to have this radial gradient function, and it has a few different parameters, cx1, cy1, cx2, and cy2. And those are the 4 parameters that really drive the center points of the gradient. And then R1 and R2 establish the radius of the start and end radii. That's how you sort of define this whole entire circle gradient within this radial gradient function. Excuse me. So there are some fantastic examples here in the blog post that really demonstrate this nicely. And one thing that I'm really sort of taken aback by is this group parameter that you had foreshadowed here, Eric. And I guess that's available since R4.2. And it controls whether a gradient applies to individual shapes or to a set of them. And I guess it's true by default, which in the case of this scatter plot example, the points have different colors sort of based upon, the gradient sort of applies to the whole chart, if you will. So the points have different colors, as opposed to in the second case when the group argument is set to false, all of the points look exactly the same, but they have this radial gradient inside each point. And it creates this sort of 3D look where each of these points on the scatter plot looks three-dimensional itself. It looks like a ball that's sort of coming off the page, which is absolutely incredible. It makes me want to throw everything on this blog post. Makes me want to throw away every single ggplot I have ever made, because they don't look nearly as nice as what James has put together here in terms of his data visualization. This is a Quarto blog. You would almost not know it, just because the theming and the CSS that's going on here is absolutely beautiful. And as you mentioned, some of these different bar charts as well, where we get into this grouping possibility, really drive pretty stark contrasts depending on whether you set group equals true or group equals false. Another thing that James employs here is the ggforce package, and I have a awful confession to make today, but I have never used the ggforce package, and I need to use the ggforce package because I think it's doing a lot of the really cool stuff that's going on here, or at least making it easier than just doing it, in raw ggplot, although I imagine that's probably possible. Have you been a user of ggforce, Eric?
I have not, and like you, I'm getting the nudge to try this out because I'm seeing a lot of novel use cases for it these days.
Me too as well. So the blog sort of concludes with, being able to sort of abstract a lot of things that you may have done in CSS to, R code for these radial gradient specifications, that you can create sort of backgrounds on your plot as opposed to creating gradients within the elements of your plot, really sort of setting kind of these interesting rainbow backgrounds on these simple plots that really provide for some cool theming here, I would say. And this is a lot of stuff that I would have never really thought about or considered in the type of data visualization work that I typically do. And there's a really handy preview underscore gradient function that allows you to get a small bar, I believe, in your plot viewer that shows the gradient before maybe you apply it to a particular element of your chart. So that's a really, really nifty option. It sort of reminds me of the theme previewing that we can do in BSLib, if I'm not mistaken. So a really handy utility function here, but a phenomenal walkthrough of applying gradients in R in ggplot2. I think James really covers sort of the whole universe of what's possible.
Yeah, and what James is showing here, especially as you alluded to in this last part of the post, this kind of stacking mechanism of these different gradients. This is one of those pain points that he used to have with going to Illustrator, was to create these more custom layered approaches to these different gradients for backgrounds and the like. And now with a great example of code here that he has, he calls this function stack underscore patterns. You can see the recursive nature of this to be able to wrap all this into one type of gradient and to be able to, leverage that as much as you like from both the linear side of it as well as the radial side of it. And you can see at the end of the post these really eye-catching backgrounds on these different scatter plots and bar charts. There's a lot of wonderful features here. And yeah, like I said, even those that may be more familiar with CSS, he ties it all together of how that works on the CSS side as well. Lots of expandable details here. He makes great use of Quarto here. This is a fantastic post, and I'm bookmarking it right now before I leave this episode because I want to up my visualization game, and gradients look like a wonderful way to do just that. Excellent post here by James.
Coming straight back to this post the next time I make a ggplot.
Yeah, and count that with like the 20 or 30 others that we covered in recent weeks, it seems like. There's so much in this visualization space that I'm just scratching the surface of for sure. I've been on the kick of interactive plots lately, but man, at some point you got to get to those static plots at the end, whether it's a report or, I hate to say it, even one of those PowerPoint decks. So if I have to be in those static confines, I'm gonna bling it up with this for sure. And there's a lot more you could bling up too by reading the rest of the issue. And it's a jam-packed issue that John Calder has put together for us. And we'll take a couple of minutes for our additional finds here. And this is someone who we've covered their journey on reproducible analysis, and especially in the case of leveraging Nix as part of that journey for, over a year, if not more. But in my additional find here, Bruno Rodriguez has turned, what I knew about Nix and Rix upside down, so to speak, because he is announcing a new package called rixpress. This is, to put it mildly here, a new take on reproducible analysis pipelines powered by Rix. That should have a keyword that you may latch onto if you know some other key reproducible analysis pipeline toolkits we're talking about. But I'm still wrapping my head around what he's accomplishing here in rixpress. But in a nutshell, when you have a pipeline of analysis, rixpress is leveraging Rix for each step in this process, which opens up the possibility that maybe for a given step for analysis or text mining or whatever have you, because of the power of Nix under the hood, you have the flexibility in these steps to go from, say, R to Python or another language that Nix supports. This is unbelievable. Now, again, he is very much stressing this is a prototype. Do not use it in production yet. He's still working out the kinks of a few things, such as how we pass objects back and forth through these steps in the pipeline. But he is the elephant in the room, so to speak. He has been heavily inspired by targets, and this is not replacing targets. Let's not kid ourselves. But what this is showing is the potential for a multi-language analysis pipeline in the spirit of targets, but with a lot of granular control at the dependencies at each step, not just in the overall pipeline. Immensely thought-provoking here. I am going to wrap my head around this, but I admit this is kind of timely because I'm going to be speaking about the virtues of Nix and Rix with my Shiny development at the upcoming Shiny conference, which is happening in a week and a half. So rixpress is something that's new, but I'll make sure to plug that in my talk at the end. So Bruno, as usual, every time I think I figured it out, you change the question, so to speak, as Roddy Piper would say. But nonetheless, it was an excellent find here. So Mike, what did you find?
That's awesome. I found a recreation of 538's Hack Your Way to Scientific Glory website that was done by Andrew Heiss, who's always just pushing out incredible content. And it is a dashboard, so to speak, but all in observable JS, OJS. So what that means is that I think there's essentially serverless, right? No, it's a static site, if you will, but it is very interactive and really feels almost like a Shiny app, if you will. And it's beautifully done. I really love the theming here. And the idea is that you're a social scientist with a hunch that the U.S. economy is affected by whether Republicans or Democrats are in office. And you can choose a few different toggles here, your political party, which sort of politicians you want to include, what measurement do you want to use for economic performance, like GDP or inflation or stock prices. And then what you're going to get is a p-value at the end of this, based upon whether that political party had a negative or positive impact on the economy. So it's a little bit of p-hacking going on here. It's a cool exercise to be able to just kind of switch dials until you get what's called a publishable result, which would be a p-value of less than I think 0.05 or 0.01 in the case of how I believe Andrew has put it together here. But it's awesome. It's a fantastic, I think, use of OJS, and I imagine maybe Quarto to publish it, and really, really cool work.
This is fun to play with. I'm playing with it right now, and this is one of the advantages of bringing in observable JS in a Quarto doc. It is just snappy responsive, and this loaded right away. Obviously, this is just taking advantage of OJS, so we don't have the WebAssembly stuff going on here, but you don't need to in this case. It is fit to the point, and obviously in my industry, I take the issue of p-hacking quite seriously, but in this could be a fun way to exercise that. So I can play with this without fearing I'm going to lose my job, so to speak. This looks fun for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's great in situations where you have fairly small data, right, to leverage OJS and the Quarto here. And probably if you Want to continue using a static site and OJS and Cordo, but your data gets big? That's where we get into maybe DuckDB, Wasm.
I think that's the future, man. That's the future. I can't wait to play some of that further. Absolutely. And before we close out here, we had put a call out for any kudos or other appreciations for our week, and we did hear back from one of our dedicated listeners, Maru Lepora, who I've had a great chance of meeting at previous POSIT conferences and other avenues. He had put a response to one of our posts on LinkedIn about our discussion on some of the issues of CRAN recently. But first, he had said he was loving the use of the continue service as a way to leverage LLMs in Positron as a way to have a front end, Visual Studio Code or Positron extension to these services. And I am literally using that now on my open source setup. It is really cool. So great recommendation there, Mauro. And his feedback on the issues that we were talking about with CRAN recently, he says, I hear the pains of developers maintaining packages on CRAN. Also, I understand the effort the core team puts into allowing the R community to live at the head, so to speak. This is a rare, costly, and beneficial approach that I came to better understand thanks to this section in the book, and he plugs it, Software Engineering at Google, which I'll put a link to in the show notes, and that's a pretty fascinating read if you want to get into the nooks and crannies of software engineering. But Mauro, this is a terrific summary here, a terrific piece of feedback. In the end, this has always been a multifaceted issue with the place that CRAN has in the R community, combined with some recent issues that we've been seeing. But in the end, there are things that I would say CRAN is still a step ahead of some of the other languages, which can be a bit more of a free-for-all in terms of package repositories, sometimes not always of varying quality, so to speak. So again, great take on that. It's never a black or white issue, I feel, with these things, but great piece of feedback, and we enjoyed hearing from you. And with that, we're always welcoming for more feedback. So from the post episode 200 on, if you want to get in touch with us, we have a few different ways of doing that, one of which is on the contact page in this episode's show notes. Take you a link right there to a little bit of web form for you to fill out there. You can also send us a fun little boost along the way if you're on a modern podcast app like CurioCaster, Fountain. In particular, it makes it easy to get up and running with these. You have link details on that in the show notes. And you can get in touch with us on the social medias. I am on Blue Sky, where I'm at our podcast at bsky.social. I'm also on Mastodon with at our podcast at podcastindex.social. And I'm on LinkedIn. Search your name, and you'll find me there. And you also, like I mentioned earlier, you'll find me as one of the presenters in a couple weeks at the upcoming ShinyConf, which I'm super excited about. And Mike, where can the listeners find you?
I'll be there at ShinyConf watching you present, Eric. That's super exciting. You can find me on Blue Sky at mike-thomas.bsky.social or on LinkedIn if you search Ketchbrook Analytics, KETCHBROOK. You can see what I'm up to.
Awesome stuff. And yeah, I remember you gave a recent plug to some great advancements of using AI in your Shiny app development. That was a really great teaser there. So hopefully you're getting a lot of success with that as well. I really thank you all for joining us wherever you are listening for this episode 200 of our Weekly Highlights. Who knows if we're going to get to 200 more, but nonetheless, we're going to have fun along the ride one way or another. And hopefully we'll be back with another episode of our Weekly Highlights next week.